Stain on her career. For as long as she could remember, Kelly Marsh had poured her heart into teaching. Even as a child, she dreamt of inspiring young minds and making a difference in her community. By the time she accepted her first full-time teaching position at Lincoln High, she carried a reputation as a rising star, dynamic, creative, beloved by her students, and respected by most of their parents. Her classroom was a safe haven where students' voices were heard, their struggles met with understanding, and their victories celebrated no matter how small. It was precisely this spark, this willingness to challenge the status quo, that made Kelly a target. Over the years, she'd noticed whispers in the teacher's lounge. A sideways glance here, an offhand remark there. Senior faculty, comfortable in their routines, sometimes bristled at her innovative approach and her dedication to the students who were usually overlooked. But Kelly tried to ignore the politics. She believed, perhaps naively, that passion and integrity would speak for themselves. Everything changed in early spring, when a seemingly ordinary day spiraled into nightmare. That morning, Kelly found an anonymous letter slipped under her classroom door. The message was terse, almost clinical. "Please report to the principal's office immediately." Her stomach dropped, but she collected herself and went. Inside, she was met not only by Principal Thompson but also by 2 district administrators and the somber face of the school board's legal counsel. What followed next felt surreal. An accusation of misconduct leveled directly at her, with reference to a student complaint she knew nothing about. Ample evidence was presented, including doctored emails and fragments of conversations taken wholly out of context. Her protests were met with icy formality. She was to be placed on immediate suspension, pending an investigation. The room spun around her as the words sunk in. All she managed to ask was, "Why don't you believe me?" News travels fast in schools. By lunch, whispers ran rampant. Staff who once smiled now avoided her gaze. Text messages from concerned parents pinged her phone, some laced with doubt, others bluntly confrontational. Kelly's own students, confused and anxious, looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes the last time she walked down the hall. By the end of that week, official notices had gone out. Kelly Marsh was under investigation for professional misconduct and barred from campus until further notice. The emotional impact was crushing. Kelly withdrew from social media, unable to stand the speculation and judgment. Coworkers she once considered friends offered only cold politeness or awkward silence. Even her apartment seemed to betray her. The stacks of lesson plans and student projects transformed into painful reminders of the life unraveling before her eyes. The worst sting of all, however, came from within. Kelly's confidence, once so unwavering, crumbled. Questions gnawed at her during sleepless nights. Who had orchestrated this? Why? Was there something she'd overlooked? Some way she'd failed to protect herself? Each memory of a supportive conversation, every joking lunch with a colleague, now felt like a scene in a play where she'd missed the most crucial cue. As spring gave way to summer, the scandal followed her like a shadow. Gossipy articles surfaced in the local paper, each more speculative and damaging than the last. Attempts to reach out for explanation or support were met with hesitation or outright avoidance. The bright future she'd built, the professional relationships she'd fostered, all seemed irreparably shattered. And yet, beneath the devastation, something colder and sharper began to crystallize. Kelly refused to let this be the end of her story. The wound would not kill her. It would become her armor. Even as her reputation was dragged through the mud by those who resented her, she made a silent vow. Whatever the cost, whoever was behind this, she would find the truth. The depths of despair. In the weeks that followed her suspension, Kelly's sense of reality grew increasingly distorted as if she'd been thrust into a waking nightmare with no clear way out. The noise that once filled her days, laughter in the halls, the hum of classroom lessons, the simple rhythm of a teacher's routine, was replaced by a relentless silence, punctuated only by the anxious beating of her own heart. Every morning became a trial. Kelly would wake well before dawn, dreading the hours ahead. The walls of her small apartment closed in around her. Her once cozy sanctuary transformed into a prison. Sunlight spilling through the windows only seemed to highlight how empty her life had become. Her phone lay silent for days at a time, and when it did ring, it was rarely a voice of comfort. More often, it was a strained inquiry or, worse yet, an automated message from the district reminding her of the ongoing investigation. The lack of purpose gnawed at her. For years, teaching had shaped Kelly's identity. Without it, she felt rootless and exposed. She lingered for hours over forgotten lesson plans and stacks of ungraded assignments, convinced she'd never again have a chance to return to the life she'd built. Each notebook, every handmade card from a student, was a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. Loneliness soon gave way to crushing isolation. Friends she thought would stand by her faded away, each finding polite excuses to distance themselves. Even her family, living halfway across the country, struggled to offer comfort. What could they say that would heal this invisible wound? Kelly grew adept at masking her pain, but behind closed doors, despair consumed her. She rarely ate and slept fitfully, haunted by nightmares where accusations multiplied and faces she trusted turned away from her. Yet beneath the weight of her grief, a deeper ache took root. The sting of betrayal. The accusation had come from inside the school, from among colleagues she had once laughed with, trusted, and supported. At night, Kelly replayed every interaction, searching for hidden animosity or careless words that might have been misconstrued. Had she missed a warning sign? Was there a moment when she could have defended herself? Or had the plot always been beyond her control? The whispers of conspiracy grew louder in her mind. The evidence against her was too meticulously crafted, emails edited, dates manipulated, a string of coincidental complaints all surfacing at the same time. It was as if someone had meticulously orchestrated every detail to destroy her career and her spirit. The injustice was suffocating. Some days, anger burned through her sadness. Other days, she could barely summon the will to get out of bed. Despite the torment, Kelly quietly clung to a thread of hope. She began to observe more closely, searching for patterns in the chaos. Whenever courage permitted, she reached out to former colleagues, not for pity, but to listen for inconsistencies in their stories. She scoured digital communications, her memory, even her own journal entries, searching for proof of a hidden agenda. Little by little, her pain gave way to suspicion, and then determination. If the world would not defend her, Kelly resolved, she would defend herself. She kept meticulous records of every encounter, every conversation, and archived them as if evidence for an unseen trial. A part of her knew that if she was ever going to reclaim her reputation, or simply bring the truth to light, she would need to act deliberately, patiently, and perhaps even colder than she believed herself capable of. Her journey through the depths of despair had not broken her. It had awakened something harder and more resolute. In the shadows of her anguish, Kelly Marsh began to prepare for her own quiet investigation. A search not only for vindication, but for the origin of her suffering. The fight to defend her name and dignity, she realized, was only just beginning. The resolve to return. The darkest months of suspension stretched endlessly for Kelly, but something fundamental inside her had begun to change. Loss had stripped away her certainty, shaken her faith in others, and forced her into painful introspection. Yet amid the ruins, a spark of willpower survived. Instead of letting sorrow define her, Kelly slowly, almost imperceptibly, chose to rebuild herself from the ground up, this time stronger, wiser, with a new edge of caution etched by betrayal. As the days warmed with the approach of summer, Kelly found herself staring at her own reflection, first with pity, then with resolve. She recognized something hardened in her eyes, the faint glint of someone who had walked through fire and refused to be reduced to ash. Without a classroom, students, or the validation of her peers, she realized she still possessed the one thing no one could take away: her mind. And it was time to sharpen it for the battles ahead. Kelly began each morning with a new ritual. Pouring herself black coffee, she would sit at her kitchen table, mapping out a plan for the day. She focused obsessively on strengthening the skills she would need most if she was ever given another chance. She enrolled in online courses on educational law, administrative compliance, and conflict mediation. She devoured textbooks and pored over case studies about wrongful accusations, the politics of school boards, and the quiet wars waged in staff rooms across the country. With meticulous care, Kelly took copious notes, building a private arsenal of knowledge she would one day deploy. But intellectual preparation wasn't enough. She also worked relentlessly to regain control over her emotions. Kelly dedicated herself to daily meditation, trying to quiet the mental noise that threatened to unravel her focus. On walks through the city park, she let herself process the sense of loss and humiliation she still felt, using the pain as fuel to keep moving forward. She refused to let bitterness consume her, promising herself that vengeance, if it ever came, would be chosen, not reactionary. Meanwhile, she observed from afar, keeping close tabs on the small world of Lincoln High. Rumors about administrative shakeups and shifting alliances among staff filtered through social media and the local grapevine. Kelly quietly cataloged names and incidents into a detailed journal, building dossiers on the people who had once worked alongside her. She identified patterns of behavior and motives, petty feuds, long-standing jealousies, and those faculty members most likely to fear exposure. One of her most transformative steps was to seek mentorship from outside her tarnished network. Enjoying a measure of anonymity on online forums, Kelly reached out to experienced school administrators and legal advocates. She studied how they navigated power struggles and dealt with hidden corruption, learning to see politics as both obstacle and opportunity. The process was humbling. For the first time in her life, Kelly accepted that she could not fight alone, and that strategic support was not a weakness, but a form of wisdom. Slowly, her sense of purpose crystallized. She stopped seeking sympathy from old friends and began practicing the art of cold, methodical planning. She grew adept at reading between the lines of public statements and district reports, all the while storing away information that might one day tip the scales in her favor. There were setbacks, of course. Nights when her confidence faltered, when paranoia gnawed at her resolve and grief threatened to drown her renewed hopes. But each time, Kelly forced herself to stand back up, driven by the conviction that her story would not end in victimhood or disgrace. In private, she rehearsed the day she would return, not as the wounded outcast, but as someone who had survived the worst and come back with the tools to change everything. By the time summer deepened, Kelly Marsh had shed the last vestiges of her former self. No longer naive or trusting, she carried herself with a quiet determination sharpened by loss. The world that once exiled her would not recognize the woman she had become. She was preparing not just to reclaim her place, but to lead, and if necessary, to deliver the justice that no one else dared to pursue. return with a new identity. 3 years had passed since Kelly Marsh last walked the polished halls of Lincoln High. The intervening time had done little to soften the raw edges of memory. Now, as the morning sun angled low through the sprawling campus parking lot, she sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel and observing the familiar red brick facade. A fresh plaque on the granite sign out front read, "Kelly Marsh, Principal." Even so, a sharp sense of unreality lingered, as if her presence here might shatter if she exhaled too deeply. Officially, her return had been lauded as an emblem of resilience. Local papers, once all too eager to speculate about her disgrace, now heralded her as a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. The real truth, however, was far more complicated. Redemption, Kelly knew, was not a simple reset. She had come back not to slip quietly into her old life, but to confront the scars of betrayal head-on, armed now with knowledge, strategy, and an earned distrust of outward smiles. Inside, the building buzzed with cautious anticipation. The school board held an early morning welcoming assembly, polished speeches, friendly applause, the thinnest veneer of sincerity. "We're so glad to have you leading us into a new era, Ms. Marsh," gushed the superintendent, shaking her hand before turning back to survey the staff, as if gauging their reactions. Kelly responded with polite gratitude and steely composure, her features betraying nothing. She could read the room effortlessly now. Seated among the staff were faces she knew intimately, allies who had faded away in her time of need, vocal critics, those who had once conspired with chilling efficiency. Some greeted her warmly, masking discomfort behind practiced smiles. Others offered only tight-lipped nods or averted eyes, their bodies stiff in their chairs. The new hires regarded her with curiosity, perhaps only half aware of the storm their principal had weathered. Soon after, Kelly retreated to her office, a space that once belonged to her greatest enemy, Principal Thompson. She noted the impersonal decor, the faint scent of old coffee ingrained in the carpet, and the tightly organized files left behind in the drawers. Here was the nerve center of Lincoln High, a stage from which power had so often been wielded for personal gain. She vowed silently, this office would now be used for something better, even if that required wielding power in ways her old self might barely recognize. Alone at her desk, she tuned into the hum of activity recommencing in the hallways. Early emails from district administration flagged upcoming audits. Teacher requests, parent queries, infrastructure complaints, all clamored for her attention. But underneath the logistics, Kelly detected subtle psychological currents, rippling through the school in reaction to her return. By mid-morning, the leadership team assembled in her office for their first meeting. Vice Principal Carter, who had once signed the papers confirming Kelly's suspension, avoided her gaze. Department heads shifted restlessly, uncertain how to navigate the altered power dynamic. Kelly led the meeting with measured professionalism, clarifying her vision, emphasizing transparency and student advocacy. Her voice was calm, her eyes unblinking, the echoes of her former warmth tempered now by something harder. The team listened intently, but an undercurrent of tension simmered just out of sight. Outside of meetings, tentative alliances began to form. A few teachers approached her offering support, some out of genuine respect, others perhaps motivated by fear or opportunism. Kelly accepted each gesture with polite wariness, always listening more than she spoke. She knew trust could not be given freely or easily. Not anymore. During lunch, Kelly did not retreat to the seclusion of her office. Instead, she moved through the faculty lounge, her presence quiet but unmistakable. Conversations faltered and restarted as she entered, snippets of gossip fading into nervous laughter. She replied to greetings with reserved professionalism, her posture upright, her eyes sharp and surveying. One or two brave colleagues made light conversation about lesson plans or school events, but the exchanges were brief, no one quite knowing where new boundaries had been drawn. For Kelly, the greatest test was stepping once again into the spaces where she had once felt most alive, the classrooms. She observed lessons with a calm detachment, making careful notes about teaching style, student engagement, classroom culture. The students, many too young to remember the details of the scandals, greeted their new principal with a mix of excitement and awe. Kelly smiled at them, her warmth genuine, but somewhere within, the pain of old wounds flashed and faded, leaving her all the more determined. Everywhere she turned, reminders of her absence surfaced. Older bulletin boards still bore photos from years past, showing classroom activities she had organized, smiling faces captured in better times. Some staffers still referred to scheduling quirks as Kelly's system, as if her influence had stubbornly lingered despite her forced exile. And yet, for every echo of her former self, Kelly found evidence of the forces arrayed against her. There were whispered meetings behind closed doors, a few damning glances exchanged in crowded hallways, a constant low buzz of speculation barely concealed by professional decorum. After school, she embarked on a solitary walk through the empty corridors. Lockers stood silent. Scuffed tile floors reflected the sun's dying light in dusty streaks. Kelly's footsteps echoed, each contact a reminder that every inch of this place had been, for better or worse, a crucible for her transformation. Alone in the emptied main office, she reviewed files on every senior staff member, their recent evaluations, complaint records, email chains. She read between the lines, searching for patterns, for the invisible fingerprints of those who had once so vigorously participated in her downfall. She noted omissions and inconsistencies, small errors that hinted at concealed motives. The work was slow, methodical, but Kelly approached it like a surgeon, coldly, relentlessly, refusing to allow old friendships or time-worn gossip to cloud her judgment. At home that evening, Kelly reflected on her first day. The faces, the tension, the forced pleasantries and glimpses of honest fear. It all replayed in her mind with clinical clarity. She felt anew the weight of responsibility and the tantalizing risk that came with authority. The temptation to trust again was strong, but every instinct in her demanded vigilance. Only when she closed her eyes did Kelly allow herself to feel just how much had changed. Certainly she had returned, but not as the girl who had once believed in simple justice or the woman broken by betrayal. She had become something else entirely, a survivor shaped by cruelty, an architect of quiet retribution, a principal determined to remake her school and rewrite her own legacy. In this new role, Kelly moved with a sense of purpose and power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. For now, she let herself appreciate the simple, heavy truth. She was home. But this homecoming was nothing like those fairy tales of forgiveness and new beginnings. If Lincoln High had once been her sanctuary and her undoing, it was now her battleground, and Kelly Marsh, at last, was ready to fight on her terms. Secrets unraveled. The first weeks of Kelly's return blurred into a whirlwind of observations, paperwork, and school-wide meetings, but beneath her calm exterior, she moved with tireless intent. She was done being the naive prodigy, the wounded outcast, or even the inspirational leader the world expected to see. Now, every glance, every casual conversation, every meeting in the hallway was an opportunity to listen, to read between the lines, and to quietly gather the intelligence she needed. Kelly began her investigation in the safest way she knew, unobtrusively. She made a point of meeting with each department chair, requesting private discussions about improving school culture. Teachers, used to a different style of leadership, arrived tense or awkward. Some gushed positive platitudes, others answered in clipped phrases. Kelly listened, her demeanor open and professional, but her mind catalogued every hesitation, every deft change of topic, every subtle flicker of discomfort when she inquired about long-standing issues. Her questions were simple but strategic, about grading inconsistencies, the use of school resources, complaints quietly filed in years past and quickly forgotten. Behind closed doors, she sifted through the digital trail left behind by her predecessors. District-mandated audits, archived emails, and incident reports formed the backbone of her late-night research sessions. At times, she felt like a detective, piecing together fragments of truth from opaque narratives and half-truths. Patterns emerged, unusual grade inflation in particular classes. Frequent substitute requests clustered around certain departments, disciplinary referrals that had mysteriously vanished from the system. On a rainy Tuesday, Kelly uncovered her first concrete lead. Digging through expense records, she noticed several teacher reimbursements for classroom supplies that never seemed to appear in any classroom inventory. The numbers didn't add up. Year after year, the same staff members claimed reimbursement for outlandishly high amounts. A deeper dive revealed signatures signed with subtle variations, distinct enough to arouse suspicion, subtle enough to have evaded the casual glance. Kelly quietly flagged the documentation and began to observe the implicated teachers more closely. Meanwhile, whispers intensified in the staff lounge. No one quite knew what to make of the new principal. This was not the Kelly Marsh they remembered. Rumors swirled that she was conducting internal investigations and that the district's board had granted her unusual latitude to implement reforms. Some staffers grew nervous, recalling how easily past misconduct had been swept under the rug. Others rallied, grumbling that Kelly was on a witch hunt or simply trying to settle old scores. But Kelly was careful. She took pains to appear fair and measured, attending after-school events, listening to parent concerns, and never rushing to judgment in public meetings. Privately, her investigation grew only more rigorous. She installed new logs on gate access to monitor late-night entry into school facilities, a move she justified on the basis of safety. Within a week, she had documented irregular entries. A small group of faculty members had accessed the chemistry lab and computer room long after sanctioned hours, with no approved reason. Her suspicions sharpened. The chemistry department, long known for its insularity and the head teacher's clique, had managed to avoid several internal audits in previous years. Kelly pressed gently, sitting in on classes, quietly talking to custodial staff, and reviewing camera feeds when possible. She uncovered evidence of private tutoring arrangements organized off the books, tutoring for which students' families paid generous sums in cash, with no documentation sent to the district or notifications to parents who might have benefited from subsidized support. It was not criminal, perhaps, but it was certainly unethical, and it pointed to a culture where secrecy and favoritism thrived. What disturbed her most was how easily so many of the infractions fit together. Small incidents that once seemed unrelated, missing technology equipment, fraudulent expense reports, quietly dropped disciplinary cases, all pointed back to a handful of central figures. At the heart were several teachers, a secretary who'd worked at Lincoln High for nearly 2 decades, and even a school counselor with access to confidential student and staff files. To verify her suspicions, Kelly reached out for help under the radar. She contacted district auditors and IT personnel, officially requesting efficiency improvements, but privately hinting that closer analysis of certain files might reveal greater problems. She asked a trusted parent on the school board, one who'd supported her through her exile, to review months of budget allocations with a critical eye. The more Kelly dug, the more she noticed pushback. One afternoon, she returned to her office to find her computer had been left on, though she was certain she'd logged off and secured it earlier. A few days later, a new rumor surfaced, absurd but damaging, that Kelly herself was under investigation for improper surveillance of staff. She recognized the tactic, preemptive retaliation, a classic move from those who felt the walls closing in. Rather than draw back, Kelly pressed forward. She doubled her efforts, this time taking particular care with her own safety and documentation. Every file she reviewed, every conversation that provided a clue, she archived in a password-protected folder, labeled plainly and methodically. She began keeping a small notebook on her person at all times, jotting down the dates and contents of any unusual interaction. Each small step made her more methodical, colder, a side of herself that surprised her, but that she now recognized as necessary. By the middle of October, the web of secrets began to unravel in earnest. An anonymous email tipped Kelly to the existence of a second gradebook for several AP classes, a hidden file in which certain students' grades had been adjusted at the request of influential parents. The evidence was damning. Kelly quietly arranged for the district IT department to mirror and secure these files before confronting anyone involved. She realized then just how deeply the rot had spread, implicating not just teachers, but complicit admin, and even parents who had abused informal power. The atmosphere at Lincoln High turned noticeably tense. Staff retreated into private conversations. Teachers exchanged wary looks in the hallway. Students, catching the mood, whispered about possible changes, but most still believed everything was business as usual. Kelly's role as principal grew lonelier, her smiles more distant, her greetings more guarded. The price of pursuit was clear. The farther she walked this path, the fewer allies she expected to keep. Yet for the first time since her return, Kelly felt something approaching satisfaction. The truth was rising to the surface. She would not be rushed. She would not be intimidated. For every secret uncovered, she gained a new layer of insight and armor. The process was exhausting, and sometimes, late at night, she questioned whether she could trust even herself to keep going. But her resolve was no longer rooted in old wounds. Now it was defined by unwavering purpose. The secrets of Lincoln High, long protected by silence, convenience, and cowardice, were beginning to crack open. Kelly knew the next steps would be dangerous. But what she no longer feared was the darkness itself. Rather, she set her sights on those who had thrived within it, preparing herself for the coming storm. The first strike. Kelly was no longer willing to remain in the shadows, quietly amassing evidence and whispering suspicions into the void. After weeks of meticulous groundwork, haunting late-night investigations, and cautious information gathering, she knew she was ready to expose the first crack in Lincoln High's carefully constructed facade. The school had survived for too long on secrets and complicity, but now, the web of deception binding it together was about to be snapped, one strand at a time. She spent the weekend before her action in absolute solitude, reviewing her files and cross-checking every detail. Her living room became a war room, covered in spreadsheets, handwritten timelines, and sticky notes coded by color, each one a piece in a puzzle she had finally begun to solve. She did not allow herself even a moment of second-guessing. The evidence pointed squarely to Ms. Thompson, a long-standing department chair known for her charm in public and her ruthless efficiency behind closed doors. It was Ms. Thompson who had coordinated unauthorized expense reporting, arranged for grade changes under the table, and overseen the off-the-books tutoring ring that siphoned money and opportunity away from students with the greatest need. Her signature, Kelly saw, was etched across every major infraction. The decision was obvious. If Kelly was to restore any sense of justice, Ms. Thompson had to be the first domino to fall. Early Monday morning, as autumn sunlight filtered through her new office windows, Kelly assembled her case. She formatted a secure report detailing each infraction chronologically and attached copies of bank receipts, falsified documents, and digital access logs. Then, with a steady hand, she sent the folder to the district's head of compliance with a succinct, formal message. The response was swift, swifter than even Kelly had anticipated. Within hours, the district superintendent arrived on campus with a legal representative and a member of the Human Resources Department. Kelly's heart hammered as she accompanied them to the conference room where Ms. Thompson was called in. The meeting was brief, the mood icy. Presented with the evidence, Ms. Thompson offered little resistance, only outrage and denial in equal measure, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. But the facts spoke for themselves. As the school day unfolded, word of an emergency administrative meeting spread rapidly. Teachers exchanged charged glances. Students saw unfamiliar faces from the district office striding purposefully through the halls. No official announcement was made, but Lincoln High was a place where rumors traveled faster than truth. By noon, the staff had already pieced together the essentials. Ms. Thompson had been suspended, pending a full investigation. The first strike had landed, and its reverberations were immediate and profound. In the staff lounge, silence reigned at lunchtime. Conversations were stilted, eyes darting with anxiety or suspicion. Colleagues who once dismissed Kelly as a relic of her own controversy now eyed her with a new wariness, uncertain if she was their avenger or their executioner. Some staffers, resentful of Miss Thompson's power, allowed themselves a fleeting sense of vindication. Others, especially those who owed favors or had themselves skirted the rules, felt the cold edge of panic creeping in. Kelly herself refused to gloat. She moved deliberately through her afternoon, attending to routine matters with the same calm detachment that had become her shield. Yet inside, a torrent of conflicting emotion roiled: relief, exhaustion, grim satisfaction, and the gnawing awareness that this was just the beginning. The act of exposing Miss Thompson could not and would not be contained. The entire ecosystem of hidden alliances was shifting in reaction to her move. That evening, she was summoned to an emergency session of the school board. The board chair, once feigning sympathy at her past humiliation, now looked at her with a mixture of deference and trepidation. The meeting was tense. Board members debated whether Kelly's probe would tarnish the school's reputation or whether it was finally time to own up to years of malpractice. There were concerns about legal repercussions, fears of how the parents and the press would react once the news inevitably broke. Kelly listened, measured her words, and reminded them, "This isn't about appearances anymore. It's about doing what's right for every student and teacher who's been hurt by this cycle. We're either part of the solution or we're complicit in the problem." By the time she left, the gravity of the steps she'd taken pressed upon her like a physical weight. But she also realized, with quiet pride, that the version of herself she brought into that boardroom was finally aligned with the person she aspired to become. Strong, unwavering, and unafraid to confront injustice head on. Back at home, Kelly barely slept. Her inbox filled with anxious queries from the district, requests for clarifications, and, most unexpectedly, tentative words of support from a handful of teachers who had steered clear of controversy in the past. One message caught her off guard, an anonymous email that read simply, "Thank you for doing what none of us could." The next morning, as she walked into Lincoln High, a palpable sense of unease hung in the air. Students gathered in small groups, whispering about the absent Miss Thompson and the sudden presence of district officials. Kelly felt the weight of hundreds of gazes tracking her every move, but she no longer flinched beneath their scrutiny. Her first strike had not only exposed a network of wrongdoing, but shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had protected it for years. Staff wondered who would be next. Those with clean consciences found themselves wondering how deeply the rot had spread, while others scrambled to cover their tracks or seek new allegiances. The balance of power at Lincoln High had begun to tilt. And as Kelly watched the sun rise through her office window, she knew there was no turning back. The battle for the heart of her school was truly underway. Storm within the school. The suspension of Ms. Thompson sent shockwaves through Lincoln High that did not subside. Instead, they built to a storm. By the next morning, the campus felt charged with nervous energy. The intricate web of alliances among staff began to unravel, gossip and speculation swirling into a tempest of suspicion, fear, and anger. Kelly, now in the eye of the storm, recognized that what she had unleashed could no longer be contained or controlled, not by policy nor force of will. The staff chatter was relentless. In hushed voices in the hallways, over lunchroom tables, behind closed classroom doors, teachers debated Kelly's intentions and the investigation's scope. Some lamented the loss of stability, however illusory it may have been, while others whispered about overdue justice. Department meetings that once focused on curriculum devolved into tense debates about records keeping, budgeting, and who might be next to fall under scrutiny. The bravest, or most careless, subtly accused Kelly of conducting a witch hunt or vendetta. But most kept their heads down, reviewing their own actions over the years, trying to recall what secrets might lie buried in old emails, receipts, or forgotten complaints. Administrative routines were shattered. The Human Resources Office was flooded with requests for copies of personnel files and clarification on district policy. The IT department now worked after hours, forensics teams combing through logs and communications in search of corroborating evidence. Everyone with something to hide, or something to prove, grew increasingly cagey. But the lines of conflict were not neatly drawn. In every department, Kelly sensed the divisions. A few quietly cheered her boldness, while others regarded her as an existential threat. Several teachers banded together in informal alliances, comparing notes and forming strategies to shield themselves, or, in a few desperate cases, to divert attention by implicating rivals. A minority doubled down on their denial, weaving elaborate narratives in the staff lounge about Kelly's supposed vendetta, her dangerous obsession with control. One evening, Kelly found a stack of anonymous printed flyers stuffed in her office mailbox. As internal pressure mounted, the external world began to close in. Local journalists, tipped off by strategic leaks from disgruntled staff, began staking out the parking lot in the early morning hours. Camera crews waited outside the school gates. The leadership team was inundated with media requests for comment, their phones pinging well into the night. Kelly herself became the focus of uncomfortable headlines. Principal or perjure? Is Lincoln High on a witch hunt? And cautious editorials weighing the cost of rooting out corruption against disrupting a community institution. Parents flooded the front office and district phone lines with demands for explanation. The PTA, usually placid, held an emergency meeting that stretched late into the evening. Some parents wanted tough leadership and a full accounting. Others were more concerned about school rankings and whether their children might be implicated in grading scandals. In this charged climate, mistakes and fractures appeared everywhere. A veteran teacher in a moment of panic deleted years of email records, only to trigger an automatic security alert and a visit from district IT. Another, frightened by whispers of criminal liability, left a tearful voicemail admitting to minor infractions from years ago. Each blunder fed new rumors, new anxieties. The staff room, once filled with easy banter, became a space of tense silence and pointed, coded conversations. Kelly soon realized that fighting corruption meant navigating a maze of raw emotions and unpredictable retaliation as well. Her own inbox, overflowing with complaints and tips, some credible, some wild inventions, became both her evidence log and a psychological minefield. A few anonymous emails threatened legal action or menaced in veiled language, but Kelly could not afford to waver. She understood the playbook of intimidation and distraction. She documented everything, kept digital and paper backups in secure locations, and made a habit of leaving for home by different routes each night. Still, she could not ignore the sense that she was being watched. Her office entered after hours, files copied, conversations recorded. One late evening, as she left her office, Kelly glimpsed a shadow just beyond a stairwell landing, vanishing before she could identify it. Another time, her car was keyed, a crude warning scratched into the paint. Even as the school roiled, Kelly appeared calm in public, radiating composure in meetings, greeting students in the halls, attending sports events and drama rehearsals. She fielded questions from parents with patient, careful clarity, promising transparency, but always holding close the details she needed to protect the ongoing investigations. Each day felt like a battle to maintain her center, her purpose. Not vengeance, but accountability and long overdue change for Lincoln High. Yet for all her vigilance, cracks appeared even among her supporters. A counselor who once offered inside information suddenly grew distant, frightened by the scope of the investigation, or perhaps realizing her own missteps might surface. A junior teacher who had quietly cheered Kelly's reforms begged to be left out of the next audit, citing family concerns. Kelly learned to trust few, to compartmentalize what she shared, doling out information strictly on a need-to-know basis. Students, too, were quick to sense the undercurrents of the storm. Rumors about secret gradebooks and late-night meetings spread like wildfire through group chats. Some older students speculated about teachers being taken down or blacklisted, while a fearful handful suspected the whole school might lose its accreditation. For many, the circus of adults only fed cynicism, not about Kelly, but about authority itself. In private, exhaustion threatened to swamp Kelly. Sleep became fitful. Her dreams replayed tense interviews, confrontations, last-minute revelations. Old wounds of betrayal, public shaming, self-doubt ached more with each escalation of tension. Through it all, however, she never lost sight of her mission. "You started this," she whispered to her own weary reflection. "Now see it through." As autumn deepened, the storm inside Lincoln High showed no sign of abating. If anything, the stakes continued to rise. Kelly understood she had brought the school to a dangerous crossroads, and that everyone, herself included, would soon have to answer for their part in the chaos or the cover-ups. For better or worse, the age of comfortable silence was over. And at the storm's eye, Kelly Marsh stood resolute, prepared to weather the backlash and lead Lincoln High through the reckoning still to come. The confrontation. For days, the halls of Lincoln High had been thick with anxiety, rumor, and whispered threats. Staff gathered in uneasy clusters, trading speculation about who would be called in next, who might confess, who might turn traitor. It was clear that the shifting climate had reached a boiling point. But no one, perhaps not even Kelly herself, could have foreseen just how explosive the coming confrontation would become. Kelly prepared carefully, reviewing every scrap of evidence and every statement she had gathered in her long, sleepless weeks of investigation. The time for observation and silent maneuvering had passed. After recent administrative interviews, tense and sometimes tearful, she was certain of the key players behind the school's darkest secrets. There would be no more waiting or quiet intimidation. If Lincoln High was to have a future, truth had to take center stage. It was Thursday afternoon when Kelly summoned the central figures. Mr. Barron, the vice principal who had conveniently overlooked years of irregularities. Ms. Halston, the veteran counselor with deep ties to both staff and influential families. And Ms. Finley, a respected senior teacher whose charm had long masked her web of off-the-books dealings. Each was called, by personal message, to the conference room at the end of the staff hallway, a cold, windowless chamber that now felt like a courtroom. When they arrived, suspicion and bravado mingled on their faces. Mr. Barron's jaw was set, attempting a show of indifference. Ms. Halston glanced briefly at the others, eyes wary, lips already pressed into a defensive line. Only Miss Finley appeared truly composed, taking her seat and crossing her legs with practiced elegance. But even she betrayed a tension in the tightness of her grip on a leather binder. Kelly stood at the end of the table, a dossier in front of her. She didn't sit. There was a heavy pause. For a moment, even the clock seemed to have gone silent. Kelly methodically laid out her case. Mr. Barron, I have digital logs showing your override of disciplinary records, files that should have triggered district review but instead vanished from the system. There are also encrypted email threads connecting your office to gradebook alterations in 3 departments, your authorization, your timestamps. I have copies, of course. He shifted in his seat but said nothing, swallowing hard. Kelly pivoted to Ms. Halston. You received cash payments from parents, funneled through anonymous donations, funds that should have gone into scholarship accounts. Instead, they wound up subsidizing private tutoring and buying influence over student placement. I have banking records, message transcripts, and 2 written statements from witnesses to those exchanges. Halston's calm cracked. People here don't understand the pressures we were under. She began, but Kelly cut her off. We'll get to explanations when I ask for them, Kelly said coldly. Ms. Finley, your involvement in the unauthorized tutoring operation is ironclad. There are invoices, parent emails, and interviews with students who believed they were buying legitimate school services. The paper trail ends at your bank account. I'll let you explain that if you want. Finley smiled thinly. I assume this is your attempt at leverage, Kelly? Do you honestly believe you can ride into this job on a moral crusade and not destroy what's left of this school in the process? Kelly's voice was frost. This is not about crusades. This is about children. A school where they believe their teachers stand for something better than the petty, selfish games you've all played. She turned to the whole room. If you think this is just about one person's ego, you haven't been paying attention. I have already sent this material up the chain, and law enforcement will see everything by tomorrow. The room grew even colder. There was a beat of silence before Mr. Barron finally broke. His facade crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Kelly didn't blink. That may be true, but covering for one another is finished. The old rules, the code of silence, died when you chose to gamble with students' lives and futures. The board is convening an emergency hearing next week, and you will all be given a chance to admit your role or contest the findings in a legal forum. This is your last opportunity to clarify your involvement. Otherwise, the documents do all the talking. Suddenly, Ms. Halston launched forward, her calm gone, voice shaking with desperation. You think the parents are going to thank you? This school survives because some people pull strings. You'll ruin it for everyone, Kelly. No one's hands are clean, not even yours. Kelly's jaw hardened, but she refused to flinch. You're right. I made mistakes. I trusted people who didn't deserve it. But my worst mistake was letting fear dictate my actions. I won't make that mistake again. Ms. Finley rose to leave, but Kelly's voice stopped her at the door. If you walk out, you do so under official notice. Legal counsel will be in touch. I suggest you prepare to account for your actions, fully and honestly. The 3 conspirators looked at each other. Years of collusion, rivalry, and evasion crashing down in the hard fluorescent light. For once, the usual arrogance of the guilty was shattered. In its place, calculation and dread. Each now realized their schemes, long hidden in the cracks and shadows, had finally been dragged into the open. As the door closed behind them, Kelly felt the adrenaline leave her in a shuddering wave. The showdown had been brutal, but necessary. She sat for a moment in the echoing quiet, hands trembling just slightly as she gathered the files and composed her brief summary for the board. The sense of danger had not passed. In truth, this confrontation would only intensify the backlash. But a deeper resolve settled over her, heavier yet more certain. She had faced the worst the system could throw at her. She had confronted those who once wielded power with impunity. Now, for the first time, Lincoln High stood on the brink of confronting its own ugly truths, and Kelly, whatever storms still lay ahead, had proven she would not back down. The reckoning, at last, had begun. Justice delivered. In the days that followed the confrontation, the entire atmosphere at Lincoln High grew both charged and heavy, like the air after a thunderstorm, renewed but unsettled. Every corridor, classroom, and office hummed with anticipation. The old regime's grip had broken, and now everyone seemed to wait for the next move, for justice not simply to be threatened, but to be done. The district wasted no time. As news of the scandal broke beyond the school, external investigators, district attorneys, and auditors arrived in a steady stream, their presence felt in every wing of the building. Board members set up a series of closed-door hearings that would stretch for weeks. Word spread quickly. Past and present staff, parents, and even some former students were called to give testimony. Lincoln High became ground zero for a reckoning that many had believed would never come. Kelly approached the coming days with the same meticulous focus she once used to build lesson plans and cultivate student trust. She supplied every document, every backup file, every email. She answered not only for herself, but also for her position as the face of the school during its most turbulent hour. She did so with poise, owning her past mistakes, but refusing to shield the truly culpable any longer. On the day of the first public disciplinary hearing, hundreds gathered in the school auditorium: faculty, parents, journalists, and district officials. The press table at the back was crowded. Camera flashes punctuated the hush that descended as the proceedings began. The superintendent opened with a statement. The accused, now stripped of their masks of untouchability, faced the consequences of their actions. Ms. Thompson's fate was the first to be decided. The auditors laid out the evidence: embezzled funds, kickbacks hidden through false receipts, proof of falsified grades for the children of major donors. For the first time, Ms. Thompson was silent, unable to muster the bravado she once wielded so easily. The verdict was swift: termination, permanent revocation of her teaching license, and referral for criminal prosecution. Next came Mr. Barron and Ms. Halston. Public testimony described their roles in the network of favoritism, the cover-up of discipline problems, the quiet twisting of bureaucratic levers for personal gain. Tearful staff and parents told stories of opportunities stolen and trust betrayed. When Ms. Halston's long-hidden accounts came to light, the district's legal representative recommended immediate dismissal and criminal charges. Mr. Barron, his head down, barely spoke as the board explained the profound breach of public trust he had allowed, the students he had failed to protect. His contract was terminated on the spot. Others faced lesser but still painful reckonings. A handful of faculty received suspension and mandatory ethics retraining. The long-serving secretary, who had helped conceal missing funds, agreed to resign. Several external families named in the admissions and grading manipulation scandals agreed to community service and returned illicit donations, desperate to avoid further publicity. Throughout these hearings, Kelly spoke only when necessary. She made it clear her goal was not revenge, but restoration. As the weeks passed and the worst offenders were removed, Lincoln High slowly began to regain its footing. Transparency became the norm. Kelly instituted new checks and balances, quarterly audits by outside firms, anonymous feedback portals, and strict oversight for all financial and academic transactions. Much of this work was grueling and exposed old wounds, but Kelly pushed it forward with a new kind of energy, determined that a culture of silence would never return. Some days, the cost of justice felt almost unbearable. Lincoln High's name circulated in state and even national news, a cautionary tale about greed, silence, and complicity. There were ugly outbursts in the parking lot, furious letters to the editor, and even a few staff who tried to cast Kelly as a destroyer rather than a reformer. Rumors would flare, then fade. In one emotional staff meeting, a beloved teacher broke down, lamenting years wasted living in fear of stepping on the wrong toes. Kelly reassured her, "That was never your fault. Blame the system that demanded loyalty over honesty." And yet, for every painful conversation, there were moments of hope. Students watched as once arbitrary rules changed, and new clubs devoted to ethics and student leadership sprang up. In offices long dominated by secret keepers, honest voices found space to speak. A quiet pride emerged, never loud, never triumphant, but real. For the first time in decades, teachers felt they could raise concerns without fear of reprisal. Students approached Kelly directly with questions or advice. The shift was not just procedural, but personal. Kelly found herself sought out in the courtyard by parents expressing gratitude, in the teacher's lounge by staff ready to brainstorm fresh initiatives for student success. Even those who once kept their distance began to send cautiously grateful notes. "Thank you for standing up," they read. Or, "Maybe now our real work can begin." It was not a fairy tale ending. Some wounds would remain for years, some friendships and careers lost in the fallout. But as the dust settled, the message became inescapable. Lincoln High could never return to the old patterns. Its future would be written by those who had chosen not to cover up, but to confront. And by a woman whose own suffering had gifted her not just empathy, but the steely resolve to see a difficult job through. Justice, Kelly realized, was never perfect and rarely felt kind in the moment. But as she watched students laughing in the courtyard, teachers posting schedules and notes without fear, and saw the first tentative smiles between colleagues who once only shared suspicion, she knew the price was worth paying. For the first time, Lincoln High was not just surviving scandal. It was changing for the better. And as the leaves turned gold on the trees along the campus sidewalk, Kelly found herself resolved. What had begun as her personal nightmare had, finally, opened the door to lasting change. Cold epilogue. Kelly stepped out of the boardroom into the late afternoon light, her gait steady, her face composed, the trace of old warmth replaced by a new and deliberate chill. Behind her, the echoes of heated voices and gavel strikes lingered, but in her eyes there was no triumph, only the sharp, clear recognition of what justice demanded and what it took from those who pursued it. Outside, the world went quietly about its business. The campus was oddly peaceful, the last remnants of autumn sunshine filtering through near bare branches. For the first time in a long while, Kelly had the rarest sensation. Nothing pulling at her from every direction. She drew in a deep breath, letting it wash through her like winter wind, as if it might finally sweep the haunting anxiety from her muscles. Justice at Lincoln High had been delivered, but it had come at a cost. No one spoke much of victory. Some still shunned her. A few retired teachers quietly packing up their rooms, longtime staffers still avoiding eye contact in the hall. There were parents who would never forgive the chaos, families whose names had been whispered through the hearings, grudges that would last long beyond the semester. Still, beneath the surface, Kelly sensed that something fundamental in the school's DNA had changed. The culture of secrecy and survival, forged over years of small betrayals and silent deals, had been cracked open at last. She walked the corridors, struck by an unaccustomed stillness. No longer did rumors swirl relentlessly around every corner. Student laughter felt more natural, less forced. Faculty conversations, when they occurred, happened in clearer view instead of hidden huddles. The school was wounded, but also strangely cleaner, like a raw stone newly exposed to light. Change, she realized, didn't feel like a fresh coat of paint, but more like an old scar. Tender, ugly, but a promise that the injury may never recur. Kelly's own transformation was part of the story. In the mirror each morning, she saw not just the lines of exhaustion, but also a stronger jaw, a set to her eyes she had once mistaken for coldness. The wide-eyed, trusting girl who'd believed goodness alone would triumph was gone. In her place was someone who understood what consequences meant, someone who chose responsibility over sympathy. Her new toughness was neither anger nor bitterness, but the product of hard choices made under the weight of truth. Following the hearings, her daily life became a ritual of caution and resolve. She responded to emails with professionalism, never indulging in catharsis or retribution, even when baited. She received letters, some full of gratitude, many bristling with accusation. She understood that not everyone saw her intervention as heroic. To some, she remained the destroyer of old comfort, the face of painful transparency. In staff meetings, there were polite silences. Some teachers were openly warm. A few were eager to rebuild. Others simply did their jobs, waiting to see if her reforms would truly last or be reversed by the next school board. What she hadn't anticipated was how much she herself would miss the naivete, the easy camaraderie, the lack of calculation. Friendship, she now realized, was often built on a foundation of shared ignorance or mutual blindness to flaws. The teachers she still called friends were those who had stayed honest, even when it hurt. And though their numbers had dwindled, the authenticity in those relationships had grown fierce and unbreakable. She treasured every honest conversation, every small act of trust that survived the crucible of scandal. At home, Kelly's world was more orderly now, but also lonelier. She had become an early riser. Long before sunrise, she made black coffee in a quiet kitchen and reviewed school policy, budget requests, and new student leadership proposals. In the evenings, she cataloged the changes, updating her records with every improvement or setback. She allowed herself few luxuries. There were nights she thought about leaving, about whether this fight was supposed to define her whole life, or if somewhere else could offer peace without such sacrifice. But each time the impulse came, the same vision steadied her. A school where every student understood justice not as punishment, but as fairness. Where every staff member knew that decency was not naive, but powerful. The wider world, too, had responded to the reckoning at Lincoln High. The district circulated new codes of conduct drawn from Kelly's reforms. Other schools sent cautious delegations to learn from the process and from its visible aftermath. News coverage trailed off as fresher stories caught the public's attention, but for a while, the school had been a symbol. Depending on whom you asked, Kelly Marsh was either a cautionary tale or a role model, a disruptor or a beacon of renewal. She learned to accept both readings, knowing that stories always depended on where you stood in the crowd. She marked graduation with bittersweet pride. The seniors who shook her hand had watched her journey from disgrace to vindication, and they looked her in the eye with the unspoken awe of having witnessed history unfold. Many thanked her quietly, some more reserved, others fiercely sincere. The valedictorian, in a surprise to many, spoke not about test scores or college acceptances, but about courage. Sometimes, the hardest thing in any community is to tell the truth. Not about others, but about ourselves. In that moment, Kelly felt the faintest crack in her armor. a warmth she couldn't express, but never wanted to lose again. After commencement, she lingered on campus, alone under the evening sky. The buildings still bore scars of the year's turmoil: freshly patched walls, empty trophy cases, bulletin boards awaiting new stories. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had the price of this new beginning been too high? Would the school culture only rebuild itself, stronger and subtler, behind a more sophisticated mask? Could she ever let herself trust the institution that had once destroyed her? But deep down, Kelly knew the answers were never final. Justice was not a destination, but a practice, a daily insistence on autonomy, honesty, and care. She was no longer naive enough to believe in pure restoration, nor cynical enough to forsake hope. She was, at last, simply herself, changed, tested, and unwilling ever to surrender to convenience or fear. As night deepened across Lincoln High, Kelly walked slowly toward the gates, turning back for one last look at the darkened windows and silent halls. The future would demand more sacrifices. Her heart, scarred but resolute, knew this was just one chapter in a longer fight. With that, she stepped out into the chill, carrying the cold certainty and strange comfort of having chosen integrity, no matter the cost.